thank you for coming. And I just want to ask you a couple questions before we start. How many of you read mystery novels? Most of you. You look half-hearted about it. How many of you read historical fiction? Wow, excellent, excellent. Usually I get a lot of mystery readers and just a couple of historical fiction readers, so that's great. What I'm going to do is, I don't usually do readings because I figure you've either already read the book. How many people here have read my book? He has half read the book. You have half read the book. Okay, you've read the whole book? Wow, 3, great. So either people have already read the book, or they're going to read the book, or they have no interest in reading the book, and for all of those reasons, it's not a great idea for me to just stand up here and read to you. So what I like to do is talk a little bit about the process of this series coming into being, and some of the background for this particular novel, which is, I think, mainly interesting in that a lot of the subject matter is absolutely true. As I say in the author's note, and if you read it, you can't make this stuff up. It is just so amazing. And I'm glad to see so many of you read historical fiction, because I think that's a great way of getting this window into another time, another culture, another way of looking at things. And that's where I started out as a novelist. Most of my academic work was in history, and I was teaching, and I said, no one wants to listen to history lessons, so what's a better way of getting at people? And obviously, as a writer, I feel like getting at people through their hearts works much better than getting through their heads. So I started writing historical fiction, which was semi-successful for a while. But I also realized that I was not getting the kind of audience for some of these stories that I think the stories deserve. Because historical fiction, obviously, at least the way I write it, is I'm taking real events and mostly real people and peppering in things like thoughts and discussions and dialogue, which obviously we don't know what people were thinking, but to make it come alive. And some of these stories, if you spend any time in any community and look into its history, there are fabulous stories there. There's just this whole panoply of weird and wonderful and scary and amazing stories. I'm sure those of you who live here in Provincetown know that already about this town. And so what I've done, because I wanted to write about history and I wanted to engage people, and I also wanted to travel, I took a page from the book of Phyllis McGinley, who this is probably an apocryphal story, but she wrote mostly in the 50s and 60s, and she wrote what was known as romantic thrillers, which, you know, genres come and go, and there's a fashion in the way they're described. But essentially what those meant were there was an adventurous story, the protagonist was a woman, she fell in love at some point to get the romantic part in, and but there was also adventure in the story. Anyway, this story about this author is, what she would do is say, okay, where do I want to go on vacation? And then her next book would be settled in Greece or Turkey or wherever it was she decided to go on vacation. I thought that was a pretty good idea. So I started thinking about what I wanted to write, both in terms of space and in terms of genre. And I have always been a voracious mystery reader myself. And I thought, well, write a mystery. I can't write mysteries because they are so plot driven. You have to have intricacies, you have to have red herrings, you have to have all sorts of different people doing all sorts of different things. And, you know, my forte is to take events and sort of spin stories about the people who might have been involved in them. So I thought, I can't write that. And then a friend of mine, who's not a good writer but is a great idea person, said, let's try to write a mystery novel together. So we did. She came up with the plot, I wrote it. It was semi-successful. The publisher, of course, has since gone out of business. I don't think that was our fault, though. And I thought, oh, well, I can do this, you know, because I was able to, in that process, contribute some ideas to the plot. So I thought, you know, there are all sorts of different kinds of mysteries, and if you read mysteries, you probably know this. There are police procedurals, and there are cozy mysteries, and there are mysteries that cats solve, and there are mysteries that have to do with the antique trade, and all sorts of bizarre things like that. I'm thinking, well, you know, part of that is the character. Part of that is finding someone to care about and watching them go through the book. So about the same time, as I said at the very beginning of this, I'm half French, you can probably tell from my name. And I've sometimes been homesick here for France. I lived in France until I was 22, and didn't have any money to go home. So I said, I will go to Montreal. And over the years I've been going to Montreal, I have come to really appreciate and love that city. It is, it's wonderfully cosmopolitan, it's very European in some ways, and it's pretty much who I would be if I were a city, because it's part English and part French. You go into a shop there and they say, hello, bonjour, and wait to see what you respond. So I thought Montreal is great. So I started looking into Montreal's history and uncovered so much more than I had anticipated. So I thought, I've got this story, and I'm going to tell you the background in just a minute, but I thought, I've got this story, how am I going to get this story out? If I write straight historical fiction, I've absolutely limited my audience. So I thought about, well, how about if I had a protagonist who has a job in Montreal that could involve being involved in different things. I wasn't going to write a police procedural because I don't know enough about police procedurals. I would make terrible, glaring mistakes, and people would write to me and be angry and don't want all that. So, so I said, I'll find a woman because I write better about women, and I'll find someone who's got a job that would enable her to leave it from time to time, and it would also enable her to sort of have a finger in different parts of the city and things that were going on. So I came up with the Director of Public Relations, which actually is a position that doesn't exist, which is good, no lawsuits or anything there. And so I said, all right, I've got this woman. I named her Martine Leduc, nice French name, but one that Americans can pronounce, unlike Jeannette de Beauvoir. And so I got this storyline for sort of this top layer, which is the layer you're introduced to as you open the book. Or not open the book, I'm sorry, I do have a prologue, but essentially where you've got this person in the present time dealing with the fact that here's the fiction. In Montreal that particular summer, 4 women were murdered, and the police are not finding the answer, and the mayor, who is Martine's boss, says to her, why don't you liaise with the police because this could be a PR disaster for our city, and that's how she got involved. And of course, the police are pursuing the angles that police generally do, and she has a little, sort of creative side to her, and she finds out that all of these murders were tied into some things that happened in the past. So let me tell you about the past. The way I started and found out about this was something that I've actually put in the back of the book when I was researching the city and the city's history and all that sort of thing. I came across this list, which, as you see, is a fairly lengthy list, and it's all children's names. They're children who died somewhere between 1 day old and 17 years old. Not particularly shocking necessarily, except that they were buried in the burial ground of an asylum. So, not being clear exactly what that meant, I looked further into it. And essentially here we had in Quebec, in Grand, and in Montreal, and in Small, there was almost a perfect storm of bad things happening. So the first thing that happened was there were a lot of orphanages, and now I'm talking right 1930s through 1960s. There's a pretty large span there. But there were a lot of orphanages. The reason for that was because, of course, Quebec was Roman Catholic, so nobody was using birth control. And unwed mothers didn't have much of an opportunity for social advancement, growth, or much of a life, because in their village they were going to be scorned. They weren't going to be able to financially support this illegitimate child. They would have no chance at getting married again because they weren't nice girls anymore. So, and they just, in many cases, were women who really loved these children but didn't have the wherewithal to take care of them. And all these children went into these big orphanages. Some were run better than others, and in the way that all institutions are, some are run better than others. That was one thing. What happened then was that the federal government in Ottawa decided that asylums that were meant for the mentally ill really took more resources than orphanages did. So instead of paying out, let's say, $1.50 per head per orphan, in the asylums they were paying $2 per head per person. And someone had the bright idea that, oh, we could make a lot more money off these kids who mostly didn't have anyone who cared about them, anyone who even knew about them. And one of the sources I read was someone saying overnight, all these asylums, or all these orphanages became asylums. They either converted the building or they bussed the kids into a mental institution, which is just horrific if you stop and think about it. An institution with adults who were probably legitimately mentally ill, and you had suddenly all these kids in there. And that was pretty bad. And the one in particular that I write about, and I'm sure this happened all across the United States too, I'm not trying to single out Montreal, I'm just saying this is where I did my research. The photograph at the bottom of the page is actually a photograph of the asylum that I'm writing about. It's called the Cité de Saint-Jean-de-Dieu, and it's in Montreal itself. And it's a scary, scary looking place even now. They certainly are not doing the same kinds of things there now that they used to be, but you go there and you can, I'm an adult, I have nothing to do with this, I have a life, and I went there and I had this sort of frisson, this shiver of, this is a very seriously creepy place. Well, you might think that things couldn't get worse, but yes, they can. Because at the same time, and now we're talking the 50s and 60s, the CIA, which doesn't operate, of course, on American soil, operates abroad or in Canada, wanted to do some research into a kind of truth serum that they could use against the Soviet Union. This was an illegal program. By the way, none of this is particularly secret, which is what I find amazing. You can go to Wikipedia and they will tell you about this program. It was called MKUltra, and they will say, an illegal CIA program. So what they did was the same thing that we've seen in other places, and you were just talking about at Fernald State School here in Massachusetts, where they were giving them, what was it?
Radioactive cereal.
Radioactive cereal to see what happened. Right.
Used to work there.
So they said, oh my goodness. All right, so I'm sorry, I should back up. So the CIA had this MKUltra program, and what they did was they signed an agreement with McGill University in Montreal, and McGill University had a psychiatric component, obviously. That, again, you couldn't make this up. It's in this house. It's on the top of a hill that looks like the Addams Family house. It is. You couldn't have designed it better for doing creepy things in there. And it was called Raven's Crag. It was built by one of the founders of Montreal, one of the very, 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 very rich people who got their money off of the railroad. And Ewan Cameron, who was the head of the MKUltra program, was commuting up every day from Vermont, where he lived, to work at McGill at Raven's Crag at the Allen Institute. It did not take long, I think. Now, this is the only place where I will absolutely say I am not 100% certain this is true. I found 2 sources that said it was, and I think it's a very good chance that it was. But in any case, it's very possible that the folks at the Allen Institute who were running MKUltra looked over and saw this big asylum filled with kids that nobody knew about. And what a great opportunity to try out some of our stuff. Not that the asylum wasn't already doing that. There are records from people saying that they remember wheeling kids out of rooms where they had just had lobotomies, just as experimentation. So I think it's not unreasonable to think that MKUltra had a hand in that as well. All of that, as I said, is true, which I find absolutely terrifying. So I thought, okay, the best way to tell this story then is through the eyes of someone that people can relate to, and that's where Martine comes in. And Martine starts finding out some of these things and some of the ways that these 4 women who had been murdered were connected to this. And one of the things that, I don't know if you looked at the website for the Provincetown Public Library when they gave a little synopsis of what I was going to do tonight, but one of the things that has always fascinated me is that everybody's got secrets. Whether it's an individual or a community, a city, a profession, everybody's got secrets. We've all got something that we would really rather people didn't find out. What happens when those secrets become so dangerous that you're willing to do bad things in order to keep them secret? And that's essentially what this story is about. It's about someone who was involved with that, and I'm not going to say any more because I don't want to give it all away. but someone who was involved with that whole process, that whole asylum and K-Ultra and all that sort of thing, not wanting their role to become public because they've become a public figure. And I just think that's really interesting, because the more I think about that, the more I think about there are probably things like this all over the world that, you know, if we just had the opportunity to read some of these stories and know it. Now, I am not trying to say that the role of mystery fiction, or indeed any fiction, is to hold up this mirror and say, look how bad we've been, look what bad things we've done. I'm not saying that at all. And I'm not sure I'm entirely in agreement with Santayana, who said, you know, if we don't know our history, we're doomed to repeat it, because I've seen where we do know our history and still repeat it. So I'm a little cynical about that being the truth. But I do think that it's important for all of us to know where we came from. You know, there's this huge interest in genealogy, for example, and you may find out that, you know, your Uncle Ernie was a really bad drunk, or, you know, there's that cousin over there that we don't talk about much, but they're still part of your family, and you still want to know about that. And I think that that's true for us as a community, and even for us, hopefully, as a planet, that all of this is part of our story. And it's really easy to tell the fun stuff about your story, you know. One of the historical fiction books that I wrote was really lovely, because it was all about, essentially it was about the first American woman who had a pilot's license. So it was great. It was like, you know, feminism and you know, unfettered skies and all these happy things. And I'm not saying that one shouldn't, I think there should be a balance, I guess is what I'm saying. I tend to kind of go to the dark side. I'm not sure why, because I'm really a cheerful person. But I think it's important for us to know that, to know where we came from, because these people are our family. And the more that we find out about things like this, the more maybe we can be a little bit more sensitive, at least when we see other things happening. So, what else did I want to tell you about it? Tell me if you have questions at any point in this, or want food. They're both options, okay? One of the things that I think about when I write, and I think about also when I read, is that literature's role in life is myriad. I mean, there are so many things that it does. It entertains us, and it educates us, and hopefully it makes us compassionate, and it does all these things. And it's really difficult as an author to say, how do you balance the book? How do you balance the book so that, for instance, in this case, so that I can tell you some things that are really terrible to read, and still have you at the end of the book feeling like there's hope. You know, there's a possibility to smile. I can put this down and not, you know, go out and slash my wrists or something. Because I don't really want to be that depressing person who does that. And so you're always trying to find a balance. And I find this with reading too. And we were talking earlier about, it was with you, Chuck, about the, you know, your to-be-read pile. And Chuck is saying, well, I read the books in the order that I get them there. And for me, it's sort of, all right, this is what I'm in the mood for now. This is what I'm in the mood for another time. And I can read something more serious and deeper, you know, even in the afternoon than I can right before bed, because I don't want to have nightmares all night.
I do that. I have a bag. I just filled up a bag. These are my books to be read.
The TBR pile.
Not putting them away.
To be read, the TBR pile, the famous TBR pile. So yeah, so that's essentially the background to Asylum. And of course, my wonderful literary agent sold it to a great publisher, who then said, well, let's make it a series. And I said, how wonderful, a series! And then I thought, oh my gosh, I gotta write another one now. and having done what I did with this one, which was, essentially I wanted to both give you the sense of exploring this through Martine, the protagonist, but I also wanted to give a voice to the children in the orphanage, and the orphanage, and then subsequently in the asylum. So I've alternated some very short chapters that are the voice of one of the girls who was here. And And so I'm saying, okay, I've set myself, talk about painting yourself into a corner here, okay, so now they want the same thing, only different, with a different issue in Montreal, because that's where she lives. What have I done to myself? Fortunately, I was able to find a couple more topics, so the next one is due out next March, and I've just started writing the third one in the series.
Wow.
Which is exciting. But it's an interesting process, because again, I was so excited when they first said, yes, we'll sign a contract for several books. I'm like, this is like every writer's dream, to not have to keep proving yourself again and again and again. Of course, every gift has a flip side to it, doesn't it? So, anyone have any questions yet? Wow, you are such a quiet group. My people in Truro were really talking. Yes?
I'm going to read a little bit of the book.
I could read a little bit of the book if you'd like. Yes, I will do that. You have a question first.
Did you, in your research, did you actually meet any of the people who had been in the asylum?
Actually, no, I did not, but thank you for asking that, because I did want to touch on this. One of the reasons that we know a little bit about these orphans, quote unquote, is because one of the ones that survived, who wanted to turn her back on it entirely, married someone who said, this is horrible. We cannot keep this quiet. We've got to do something for these people. And he has been an extraordinary force. He was behind a documentary that was done about, they're called the Duplessis orphans, because they were at the premier of Canada was Duplessis. So they're connected to that, the Duplessis orphans. He had a documentary done, he wrote a book about it, and he enabled them to do a class action suit so that they would get some sort of money back from the government. Unfortunately, they ended up settling, because most of them, by the time it went through, were elderly and really just wanted the money to end out their days in a little bit more comfort. So they did do a deal, and it was actually, many people are saying it was the lowest in Canada's history, so much lower than, for instance, they did for the kids, the Aboriginal kids who were brought out to boarding schools to become anglicized. But so I didn't, to answer your question, sorry, that was really roundabout, but I did not meet any of them. Very few of them are still alive now. I did meet him, his name is Rob Viano, and he's an extraordinary man. The way he was able to not just stand up for justice and stand up for these people, but also enable them to look at the situation, because most of the ones that were involved in this suit didn't even want to think about it anymore. You know, I've got a life now. That was then. I was a different person. That was such a horror show. And he was able to actually convince some of them to see a therapist and to talk through some of it and to sort of come to terms with it, which I think was an incredible gift to give to them. But yeah, so he's the only one that I met in this. However, I did read a lot in his book in particular, because he did extensive interviews with these people, and that's where I got some of these particularly, gruesome things that I did not actually include in the book because they were kind of creepy, but some details about what did go on. And when I went out there to visit it, it's now it's actually still sort of a mental health place. It's divided up. Different agencies have different parts of the building, and in one of the buildings in front of it is a what's it called in English? A child care center, and they have this big giraffe with a sign. I'm telling you, you could not make this stuff up. The sign says, "Watch out for our children." Okay, that's a little ironic, isn't it? Yeah, you couldn't make this stuff up. You really couldn't. So, yeah, so there's a voice there, and I think that this particular group, I think that more and more, if you talk with other people in Montreal and in Quebec, people have heard of them. They've, the Duplessis orphans are, oh yeah, I know who you're talking about, sort of thing. The way we do with maybe Tuskegee or some of the other things that have happened here. Yeah, I kind of know what happened, sort of, is the response that you get. Many people do not know about MK Ultra. And it's interesting because MK Ultra, they did also have a lot of experiments that were pretty much above board, and they asked for volunteers. And one of their volunteers was Leonard Cohen, the musician, who particularly liked the sensory deprivation tank, which I find extraordinary. He kept volunteering to go there. I think that nothing would be more horrible, but that might explain some of his lyrics.
Yeah.
I don't know. But yeah, so MK Ultra, look it up. It's
The
one of
initials
the
M.
MK, the initials dash Ultra. Yeah, it's actually well known, and then it makes you wonder. I mean, it made me wonder. I stumbled across this, and you know how you go across the internet and you're always stumbling across things anyway. But how many other programs like that the CIA did, or that the FBI did, or that the Board of Health did, that were out there that were doing all sorts of things, quote unquote, in our name, that we don't know about because you haven't stumbled across them. So you had a question.
Is there something that within yourself or your family or history or anything that really, you know, that touched on you to make you want to write something simple like Asylum? Or
I don't know that there's anything about the history part of it. I do know that I gave Martine a husband and 2 stepchildren, and I happen to have, when I started this whole project, had a husband and 2 stepchildren. We've since divorced, but I still have 2 stepchildren. And when I first met my to-be husband and started understanding what was involved in being a stepmother, I thought, and I read every book there was on being a stepmother, and they were all horrible and useless. And I thought, all right, I'm a writer. I will write the definitive book on being a stepmother. And I was going to call it Wicked, you know? Yeah, cute, right? But unfortunately, actually being a stepmother got in the way of writing about being a stepmother. And time went by, and my stepkids are now in their early 20s, so they're not exactly children anymore. But when I was trying to decide who to make this figure, this woman that I'm going to be traveling with through many books, so I'd better get to like her, I thought, here's my chance to write about being a stepmother. So it's not as focused and as, I guess, preachy as I was going to make it if I had made it a nonfiction book. But I do, I think, get a little bit of the flavor of step-parenting in there with her. All right, so, oh, yes?
I was going to say, do you ever come across in your research about non-orphans being also taken into the asylums for this specific?
It was mostly kids from the orphanages. Not all the kids in the orphanage were orphans. Many of them had 1 or 2. Some of them actually came from a 2-parent regular family that just couldn't support them.
Yeah.
Some of them were meant to be there temporarily. So there were all sorts of levels of it. Obviously, the ones that had some of the, shall we say, experimentation done were not ones that had Aunt Gertrude coming to visit on Sundays. They were kids that nobody knew about. And if you look at this list, it's just appallingly sad because some of them have names and some of them don't. You know, anonymous child, a few hours old. You know, here's a name, Marie-Germaine Thérèse Isabelle. This is someone who her family loved her enough to give her 5 names. 8 months old. You know, it's just appalling to think of these kids. And I think that was one of the reasons I wanted to include that, was to sort of honor that and give their names out there. And one of the things that the child in the book, the little girl named Gabrielle, who is growing up in first the orphanage and then in the asylum, one of the things that was important to her was that people remembered her name. And essentially, at the end of the day, I think that's what's important to all of us. You know, whether no one wants to die, and we all want to have a sense that my having been on Earth had some sort of meaning. So some of us have children, some of us write books, you know, some of us have political office, some of us do creative, wonderful things. But behind it all, there's that impetus of, I don't want to be nobody. No one really wants to be nobody, and these kids were nobody. So I felt like in some ways it was my gift back to them to be able to say you were somebody even if we don't know your name. All right, well, I will read because it's been requested that I read. I don't usually read, so I'm just going to read you the prologue, which is about the little girl, about Gabrielle. And then the first chapter is the one that comes in with Martine and her family and her situation. The woman sitting in the back seat shivered and drew the child closer to her side. But it was a warm morning, promising summer. "Just over there," said the man sitting next to the driver, the man wearing the clerical collar. "Pull over here, the gate's just ahead." The car shuddered to a stop, and for a moment no one inside moved. The sun was just about to come up, the eastern sky behind him streaked with bits of pink cotton candy, but inside the taxi, the dark of night lingered. The woman spoke to the child. "You have your bag?" "Yes, maman." Large eyes looked up at her, round with fear. The little girl had been awakened and made to dress in the dead of night. "I don't understand. Why do I have to, maman? I don't want to go." The woman blinked back the tears suddenly flooding her eyes. "You have to," she said, her voice unsteady. She took a deep breath. "You have to go. This is your new home, mon chou. I can't come with you." "But I don't want a new home. I want to stay with you." The priest in the front seat turned and looked back at them. "It's time," he said unnecessarily. "No," the little girl said again, but this time she said it without hope. The woman opened the door and got out, extending her hand to the child, who followed obediently. A tall wooden green-painted door loomed ahead of them. "You have to go," the woman said again, looking not at the child but at the door. The girl cried out something incomprehensible, and the woman turned and sank to her knees so that their eyes were level. She dashed at the tears and forced herself to smile. "My dearest love, you must. It's for the best. It truly is." She put her arms around the child and pulled her close. "Don't forget me. Don't forget that your maman loves you." "I love you too, maman." Her voice was trembling, heavy already with loss. The woman didn't relinquish her hold. "Gabrielle, je t'aime." Her words were muffled against the child's brown hair. There was the sound of a car door opening, and the priest's footsteps crunched across the gravel toward them. "You must let her go now," he said to the woman, not ungently. He put his hands on her arms and pulled her back from the child. She stumbled against him as she stood up. "It's for her sake," the priest said. "They'll take good care of her. We've been over this, Lucienne. It's the best thing you can do for her." "Yes," the woman said again, but there was nothing in her voice but pain. The priest took the child's hand and pulled the chain beside the door. From somewhere inside came the sound of a bell pealing. A few moments later, the door opened and a nun stood framed in it. "Good morning, sister," said the priest. Her eyes took in the woman standing shivering by the car, the priest, and finally the little girl. "Yes?" "This is Gabrielle Roy, sister," the priest said. "I've written Mother Superior about her." The nun nodded and opened the door wider as the priest transferred the child's grip from his own hand to hers. "Come along then, little one," she said. The girl looked back. "Maman?" The woman stood still, sobbing, her hands to her face. The priest turned and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her away, steering her back to the waiting taxi. Behind them, the green door closed with a click. "She's safe now," the priest said. "You did the right thing, Lucienne. She couldn't have lived in the village. The children there would have tormented her. She's safe now." "Yes," the woman said again, but her heart was as empty as the clear, bright sky. So now I got totally depressed. It really isn't that as depressing a book, but it, you know, I did want to give voice to both of these women, to Gabrielle, the little girl, and to Martine, the woman who hopefully you'll stay with me for several more books.
Very nice.
Anything else? Any other thoughts? Letters from home? Anything you want to share? Okay. Yes?
What was the response you get from using both French and English in your books?
That was a very good question. Because I thought I spoke French, and indeed I speak French. I speak France French, which is not the same as Québécois French. And I'm very careful when I use French, and I've done this in other books before, if it's an English language book, to make sure that the context is clear. I don't want to give you like 3 sentences and then you're lost if you didn't speak. You know, I don't know if you read The Name of the Rose, but if your Latin wasn't 100%, you felt like you were missing all the good jokes. I don't want people to feel that way, that, you know, oh wow, there's a whole passage here I didn't get. So I'm always careful to either provide some sort of translation or a context. So I didn't get any pushback from that. What I did get, and was very careful on the second one, was I was up in Montreal last October and talking with the people that I usually stay with when I go there. And she was saying, you should have checked this with me. And I said, what? You know, I speak French. Of course I speak French. I'm a native French speaker. And I did make a couple of very slight errors in my French. Not errors for France French, but errors for Quebec French. So for the second one, I made sure that I sent everything up to them and said, all right, correct it. And indeed, there were 2 corrections again, because I don't stop and think, when I'm up there and I'm speaking French, no one obviously corrects you, and they always say, well, you're from France. The same way, if we're speaking to someone here from England, you don't say, oh, that's not the way we say it here, by the way. No one would say that to me, so I would be just fine going ahead with my French. And so I'm learning to be cautious. And you know, I should have known this, because I will tell you, my historical research, partly because that was my academic background, is really good. I mean, I really research things to death. But this was not always the case. And let me bring you back to my first ever published novel, in which I didn't do quite as much research as I might have done. And I wrote it when I was just in this country. It was my first book in English. And I had this, you know how we think of, Americans think of France as the Eiffel Tower and, you know, maybe the Riviera, but mostly Paris. Well, in France, people think of the United States as being New York, Chicago, and California. And California is just everything over there. And all of California is, of course, Beach Boys territory. It's the ocean, it's the surfboards, it's all that. So following in that fine tradition of not understanding anything about the country I was writing about, I had a character taking a walk on the beach in San Jose. And let me tell you, this was pre-internet, and people took the time to write me letters by hand pointing out my mistake. Do not think that people do not tell others when they make mistakes. And of course, it's there forever once it's in print. You know, you can't go back to the publisher and say, oh, can we do another edition because I just found out I really goofed. Yeah, so after that I learned that you do your research twice, maybe 3 times. Sort of like trivia. At least my trivia questions. No, I'm very careful. And I should have been more careful with this, with the French. It just never occurred to me that I would have to research that, because I spent so much time researching the history that I thought, I've got it all down. But that was a very good question. And you had a question.
Yes. When you're writing a series, and you are working on the first book in the series, did you know that it was going to be a series?
I did.
Is it hard to think about holding back certain information about your main character because you don't want to throw everything
at once,
you know, into the first book, but you want to keep the reader interested, of course, and following. I mean,
you're right.
My
It's
assumption
tricky.
is that it's sort of like meeting someone and having a relationship with them.
Very much so. That's a very good analogy.
Everything about them on your first date or your second date or even the first year that you have lived together, but can you speak a little bit about?
Right, it is tricky, and you're absolutely right. I've never thought of it that way, but that's a great analogy. It is like discovering a person within a relationship. What I kept doing was wanting to throw everything in, obviously, because I was excited about it. And when you're first thinking about a character, especially a character you're going to live with for a while, she lives in your head for a long time before you write any of it. You know, I was going around my normal life with, you know, Martine. And I wanted to, because I kept coming up with these, oh, let's have her do this, or let's have this be there, or, and then I realized, you know, this book is not a character sketch of Martine. And if you're going to have a series that presumably takes place over several years, what you also want to do is show your character's growth. That they're not the same person actually they shouldn't be the same person at the end of the first book that they were at the beginning of the first book, but certainly as the books progress. So although I wasn't clear when I was writing Asylum where she would be going next and what the next mystery would be, because they are mystery novels, but I spent a lot of time being clear about who she was and where her family was going, and what kinds of crises or adventures, or indeed what kinds of things in her past were going to be relevant. In this particular book, here's another one that I if you want from my life, I have her have a conflict with her deceased mother. I know nothing about conflicts with deceased mothers. Actually, I have another book that I wrote ages ago. Don't read it. But a friend of mine said, you know, the subtitle of that book should be Jeannette Goes to Therapy. Yeah, so there are ways that we novelists do work out our issues, and we don't have to pay the therapist that way. It's really great. We get paid for it instead, which is very nice. No, so I thought, okay, what I'm going to do is gradually bring in some things about Martine that will be somewhat relevant to this book, but also will sort of lay the groundwork for later. And in fact, I had this whole great idea about what happened to her father, and it was too much. It was too much, but it was great because I had pages and pages and pages of these great things about her father, which I was finding actually him more interesting for a while. This is really good stuff, and I put it aside, and it comes up in Deadly Jewels, which is the next book in the series. So there was an opportunity, and I'm fortunate. Oh, I created the opportunity. Let's face it. It's really hard when you're writing because sometimes you think, what I need to do is go with the flow of it, and then sometimes you think, but I really want this to go in, so let me create a place where I can put it in, and that's sort of what I do with her father. I hope it's not too evident. Probably be evident to you now that you know I did it. But yeah, you really want to be careful about it. You know, I did find, and fortunately I've got a brilliant editor at St. Martin's. I did find toward the beginning of the second book, Deadly Jewels, that in fact, Martine wasn't where she should have been emotionally. That, you know, my editor came back and said, she's being really sarcastic. Do you mean for her to do that? And I've always wanted her to be a little bit edgy, but not to the point of being unlikable. And so, you know, you have to really sort of be careful about plotting her personal growth so that it will spread out. And then also look at the growth of her environment. In other words, in this case, she has a husband, she has 2 stepchildren, she has friends, she has this whole social network, and they're going to be progressing too. I mean, I can't have any characters be the same because life isn't like that. Life isn't static, and you know, we aren't the same people we were when we came in this room. All of us have changed. It's just, that's life. So you're very right. It's absolutely tricky. And it's one of the things you don't think about when they first say, you want a series? And you say, of course I want a series. Anyone else have questions? Yes.
I have a question, and I'm sorry, that's a little unrelated to your particular
That's
book.
quite all right.
But I'm just curious, perhaps you know the answer to this question. I have not read your book, so I don't know if it would be for me to do it, if it's something that would be of interest to you and your publisher. But I'm a translator. I translate from English into German, and the other way around as well, but better into German. And I have read some books, and again, I haven't read yours, where I thought, you know, that would be great if that was translated and available in the German-speaking world. And I was always wondering, how would that work? I mean, how would I approach the author? Or
No, what you do is you approach the publisher. Mm-hmm. They're the ones who have the rights to it. So in other words, when I signed with St. Martin's, I gave them the rights to find if there's going to be a movie deal, if there's going to be a television, if there are going to be translations. That's all in the hands of the publisher. So what you want to do, if you want to do some of that, is get a copy, they probably have one here, of Writer's Digest, or Writer's Market, I'm sorry, Writer's Digest is a magazine, Writer's Market, and they list publishers there, and just write to all the publishers and say, you know, I mean, it lists what they do, and whatever you feel comfortable translating, whether it's fiction or nonfiction or self-help, or, and just write to them and say, and offer your services, you know, send a resume. Sure, sure. I think it's interesting, when my work's been translated, I always find it fascinating to even hear how titles change slightly because of different cultures. Right, yeah. Right.
I would think some authors would not be interested even.
Oh no, I would love to have everybody. I would love to have the whole world read my books. Are you kidding? I have plans for world domination here. Come on. No false modesty here. Anyone else? Yes, Chuck.
Yeah, I asked you this before, and I never got an answer.
I probably wiggled out of it somehow.
When you submitted the manuscript to the agent and the publishers, did they try to persuade you to change the title simply because there was earlier book called Asylum, which was made into a movie?
No, I will say that with a large, this is my first experience with a large publisher. My publishers have tended to be much smaller, and almost everything on contracts was negotiable. With St. Martin's, it's not quite the same. It's not as negotiable, and in fact, they have the say on the title. I was very lucky, however. I had chosen Asylum as a title, and my agent sold it as Asylum. And my editor at St. Martin's, this was her first book that she acquired, her absolutely first one. She was like 23, and thank you God she quit and decided to go to medical school because she wanted to change the title to They Vanished in the Dark. And I said, I've got a name that's this long already. I don't need a title that's that long. You know, if you want, because I've often written under other names because Jeannette de Beauvoir is just too difficult a name for English. You know, I mean, people can't remember how to spell it. They can't, you know, I chose Alicia Stone for one of my, because you get it really simple so people can buy the book. And they were adamant that they wanted my real name on it because they said, well, that gives you some gravitas in terms of it being, you know, partly French and all that sort of thing. So if you want my real name, then you're going to have to give me a smaller title. No, They Vanished in the Dark she wanted. Thank goodness she decided she needed to go to medical school. So off she went to medical school, and I got a new editor in, which is usually a disaster, because usually your acquiring editor is the one who kind of likes you and takes care of you because it's their project, and if they leave, you're sort of on somebody's back burner. That wasn't the case here. I got this fabulous, fabulous editor who took one look at it and said, God, I hope you're not married to this title. Oh, thank you. No, you can't copyright a title, and there are just so many titles out there in the world. So, you know, in this case, unfortunately, when you go to Asylum, I mean, to Amazon and put in Asylum, this is not even on the first page it returns. You have to put Jeannette or de Beauvoir or something in there with it. But it's a memorable title, and I think that's one of the things I go for. I had a different title for my second one than they chose. They chose Deadly Jewels, which I still think is pretty romantic sounding, like a romantic. But it's what they chose. So you don't have a whole lot of say in that with a larger publisher. With the small publishers, I never had a problem with, you know, here's the name I want to do it under, here's the title I want. But there's a lot less money and so on involved. So, yes, Sarah.
What was the name of the second book that you originally wanted?
Did I?
The original title.
The original title.
Oh, for Deadly Jewels.
Yes.
What did I want it to be? Let me think now. Oh, I know what I wanted, and I guess they're probably right. I thought we could call it the French word for jewels, which is bijou, because I think that's understandable enough for American readers. Yeah. So I thought Bijou by Jeannette de Beauvoir would be really excellent. Yeah. And they said no one's going to be able to pronounce that. And I said, I don't think that's true. And I took an informal.
Probably is true.
But yeah, exactly. It turns out it is kind of true. I tried it with a whole lot of people, and they were right, unfortunately. And it's going to be fun. I mean, it doesn't quite have I think the same sort of, wow, this is what really happened, that this one does in the same way, but it is about something that you probably don't know, which is that during the Second World War, the English Crown Jewels spent the war in Montreal under the Sun Life building. You knew that. Look at you, good. Not many people know that. So that's the basis for the next book is the jewels that are under there. But yeah, I wanted it to be bijou. And you had a question.
I was going to ask about the cover art of the book.
The cover?
Yeah.
Don't you love the cover? Yeah. Oh my goodness, they did such a great job with this. Yeah, no input from me. I have nothing to do with this.
It was a picture of the building or something.
No, the building at the bottom is indeed the very asylum that I wrote about. And so as you can see, it's very creepy looking. It's on the back also. But I just thought this was lovely. I thought they did a great job. It's okay, you don't have to, but if you want to buy a book, we are here to sell you one, and I will be happy to inscribe it for you. I thank you all so much for coming. This is